Hi, this is Travis. It is April 2nd. This is a rehearsal presentation for our podcast on resilience and redundancy in healthcare MEP systems. So today I've been asked to talk about Kaiser's approach to redundancy and resiliency. This was a popularly requested topic, so we're going to spend the next hour talking about it. And I'll tell you the bottom line up front. Most of what we do, or a lot of what we do around redundancy and resiliency, is really kind of unwise and ill-planned. We make a lot of emotional decisions. We don't really have a common industry framework for analysis. We don't do cost-benefit studies, and we really should. Our designers don't talk to our emergency planners. Our emergency planners don't talk to our designers. Our designers don't really talk or have a good vocabulary to investigate failure and make decisions based on failure rates. We do have codes in place that have requirements in them, but those are really also quite ill-planned and in my opinion, a false sense of security. So we do a lot of resiliency things, and all of it's well-intentioned. So we're spending money on these really well-intentioned things, but often when we take two steps back and look at them, while they're well-intentioned, they're not all that smart. And I'm not going to give the answer today, by the way. I'm going to give you some thoughts towards the end. I think there are some things that we can do to maybe move the industry thinking forward, but mostly I'm just going to point out the problems. So why are we doing redundancy? Well, first off, let's make sure that we understand redundancy is a bad word. If you look up redundant in nearly any dictionary, it means extra and it means unnecessary. So in the UK, if you've been made redundant, that means that you've been fired. You're extra, you're unnecessary to this company, and so go home. And the same thing happens with our building systems. Redundant components are, by definition, extra components that are unnecessary to normal operation. So if I'm sitting here at my desk and I'm writing and I have two pencils, then one of them is redundant. If I'm a single person who lives alone, I need to drive to work, I have two cars in my driveway, then one of them is redundant. It's unnecessary. And so anytime we are talking about adding extra or unnecessary components to our system, we really should always know why. And there are four reasons that I'll say are legitimate or bona fide reasons for having that conversation. And they are scalability, maintainability, reliability, and resilience. Those R words go together, and flexibility. So any redundancy that we put into our system should be driven by one of those reasons. And we should always know which one. The scalability, maintainability, reliability, and flexibility requirements should be stated with as much clarity as possible in the owner's project requirements for the project. And our Kaiser OPR templates actually has sections for each of these. I'm going to show you those. But first, we do need to know what they are. Now, if you want to remember these letters here, SMRF or SMRRF, you can remember those letters by picturing this little blue fellow right there. So let's run through those. The first one is scalability, and scalability is the capability to change in size. We're planning for some future capacity that we know is coming. You can also think about scalability investments as a risk. So if there's a 50% chance that we're going to add spaces to this project, that's also a 50% risk that those spaces won't be added to the project. So that's a 50% risk that any scalability investment we make would go to waste. And that's usually unwise. So for scalability, we either want a very high level of certainty that the scaling is coming, or we want a very low level of investment. Kaiser's standard approach to scalability is no. We used to have some scalability requirements in our MEP standards that talked about 10% growth or things like that. If you haven't read our standards recently, let me assure you those are gone. There may be some projects where we have scalability required as part of the project statement, and that would be in the OPR. But the standard approach is no scalability. Maintainability is the ease with which a product can be maintained, retained, or restored. For most spaces in Kaiser, this is a very important concept here, for most spaces in Kaiser, a planned outage at partial capacity is acceptable. So when we need to perform maintenance on HVAC units or electrical systems or lighting in an outpatient area or a patient area, we plan a periodic interruption or reduction in service. For hospital operating rooms, that's a bit of an exception. We do want to be able to maintain central systems without shutting down multiple operating rooms. In the past, we've had systems where in order to work on the air handlers, you had to shut down all the ORs, so we want to avoid that. That doesn't mean, though, that each OR has to be continuously running. We can always schedule a maintenance shutdown for one operating room, but we don't want to shut down the whole block. That's where we get in trouble. Another thing that we have noted here is air handlers. Major servicing or replacing of air handlers on hospitals is amazingly expensive. If you've never been involved in an air handler replacement project in a hospital, it is a multi-million-dollar job. It takes quite a bit of time. There's a lot of logistics. And we sometimes need to put temporary air handlers in place to maintain services while we do the project. So we do have a standard that if we're doing new construction, that we build a pair of pads right next to each other. So we have a pad next to the air handler. Put in that structure and allocate the space during the initial construction. And then when the air handler needs to be replaced after 20 or 25 years, we'll have that additional space to get the work done. And then also within our standards for maintainability, we have IT spaces called out. Those spaces we should be able to maintain the services while retaining full capacity. And then we get to reliability, being trustworthy and performing consistently, and resilience, which is the capacity to withstand or recover from difficulties. For outpatient administrative areas, if there is a periodic or a catastrophic failure, the functions of those areas simply stop. If we were to have a 4-hour power outage at a medical office building, we would not continue to provide services. It shuts down, as simple as that. The majority of our hospital services, the patient floors, the D&T block, in the case of a periodic or a major failure, we would continue to operate, but we'll be operating at reduced capacity. That reduced capacity is a very key concept. Now, there's a few exceptions to that. In the operating room, we do want to maintain full capacity during an event, but it's for a limited period of time. If we have, say, a power outage in an operating room, in California at least, we need to have 2 sources of power in place to start surgery. So if one of those goes out, then we switch over to the second source, we finish out that surgery, we finish out that case, and then we stop. We cannot start a new surgery because we don't have 2 sources of power in place. For outpatient surgeries, we also have that second source of power. In that case, it's really only there to clear the case. So if you lose main power, then you have 45 minutes of backup, and then that function ceases. And then again on this slide, you'll see the enhanced levels of reliability for those IT spaces. Then the last one is flexibility, and that's the ability to change according to different situation. Again, our standard approach on this is not to plan flexibility for our spaces. When we build an outpatient medical office building, we could build it with the flexibility to become a surgery center in the future. But if we did that for every medical office building, that would drastically reduce or increase the cost of our medical office buildings. And of course, most of them would not become surgery centers in the future. So that would be a very bad use of money. So the standard here is, again, no. So to wrap up on the section around the Smurfs, let's remember that redundancy itself is a bad word. If we're adding something that's redundant, that means that we're placing extra unnecessary components into our design. Anytime we do that, we should be serving one of these larger purposes: scalability, maintainability, reliability, resilience, or flexibility. And that purpose should always be very clearly articulated within the project requirements. Because redundancy costs, and it's not just capital costs, there is an operating cost. So if you're a single person who lives alone on a budget, it's not wise for you to buy 2 cars, not only because the initial cost of the 2 cars is double the cost of buying a car, but that second car also costs you to own. It takes up space, maybe you have to pay for parking, you're going to want to cycle it, drive it every other week. You have to make sure that it doesn't sit idle, and you need to perform regular service on it, really, whether you're driving it or not. So beyond the cost of the capital, there is a cost of ownership. And if that doesn't serve a purpose, a clear purpose that's worthy of that cost, then it is unwise. So, if I could have you take one thing away from this episode, it is that realization that a lot of those redundancy decisions that we do tend to be emotional, right? They feel good, but they don't necessarily add up to scrutiny, or they don't really stand up to scrutiny. So this section here, I'd like to talk about, well, can we make informed decisions? Can we make rational decisions about reliability measures? I mean, we are engineers. Can we use our right brain? The answer is that yes, we can. And so we'll look at a model. I want to make it clear this is a model for cost and benefit analysis of reliability measures. There are more than one model available that we could use. But first, before we jump into the model here, let's start with a few notes. First off, in hospitals, electrical systems are critical, HVAC systems are not. The person on the left side of this slide just got heart surgery and is connected to a life-sustaining equipment that runs on electricity. If the hospital were to have a 4-hour power outage, that person could die. The person on the right side of this slide is comfortable. If the hospital were to lose heating or cooling for 4 hours, they would become uncomfortable. That is a significantly lower criticality of systems. Now, as a mechanical engineer, trust me, I know all the arguments. Yes, we could have prolonged heat waves or prolonged cold waves that become a threat to life of the occupants. We could lose humidity for periods of time that promote biological growth or promote infectious diseases or what have you. Some of those arguments have more credence than others, but all of those would take days upon days, if not weeks upon weeks, to develop into a critical situation. The electrical is a critical situation immediately, right? That's not to say that if you lose heating and cooling, everybody won't complain. They will. They're going to start complaining immediately. But unhappy, complaining people is not a life-critical situation. So let's just make sure that we're always clear about that, right? The second little topic that we have to talk about is this one, and this is called simultaneous low probability events. So the rule here is that if we care at all about money, then we do not plan for simultaneous low probability events. Allow me to explain. The odds of pulling the ace of spades out of one deck of cards is 1 in 52. If you had two decks of cards right next to each other, the odds of pulling the ace of spades out of both of those decks is 1 in 5,000. Without getting into the math on how to stack probabilities, that is more than the square. 5,000 is more than 52 squared. So if we're considering a 4-hour power outage to be like a 20,000 hour event, and then we're considering a generator failure to be a 20,000 hour event, that is, both of those are roughly 2-year events, then the probability of a power outage simultaneously occurring with a generator failure at the same time is more than the square of that, which is amazingly low, right? This is a 91,000 year event. There's a problem in philosophy called the sunrise problem, which is literally like, what is the probability that the sun will rise tomorrow? These are not quite that level of odds, but it's getting close, right? Once you get past about a 10,000 year event, then you've completely left the realm of cost benefit. The bottom line is, if we care at all about money, then we do not plan for simultaneous low probability events, right? Okay, so now let's get into this model. So we worked with our in-house risk assessment experts a number of years ago on this cost-benefit model for risk mitigation measures. And I've been told that I'm going to hurt your brain with this, but we're going to do it anyway. So there's two flowcharts on this slide. The top flowchart is our base case, and the purple track on the top flowchart leads to the load, and the bottom flowchart is for a mitigated risk. You start with the top flowchart. You start with a period of time, and then there's a probability that we will have a negative event. That's shown as F. F is the probability the event will occur, or the frequency that that event is anticipated to occur. When the event occurs, there's a probability that it will compromise outcomes. There's also, by the way, a probability that it won't compromise outcomes. But G is the probability of a compromised outcome. And then, of course, that compromised outcome has a consequence. That's shown as D. D is the consequence. So that's the base case. Then we have a mitigated case in the bottom. That's the bottom flow chart. Again, we start with a period of time. Again, we have the probability of the event, which is F. Again, we have the likelihood that the event causes a negative outcome. That's G. But now we have a mitigation in place. So we have the likelihood that our mitigation will prevent the negative outcome. That's I in this diagram. That mitigation could also fail. Many of our mitigations carry less than 100% confidence. And so you could still wind up at the load. So again, you have the load. Then we bring this all together, and this is the way the math works to look at cost benefit. We take the unmitigated load of the base case, we subtract out the load of the mitigated case, and then we divide by the cost of the mitigation. So that gives us the benefit of the mitigation divided by the cost of the mitigation. Now, in practice, the way this works, and we're going to look at an example in a second, but in practice, the way this works is everything works in orders of magnitude. So you'll see that. And so we're assigning a letter grade here based on orders of magnitude. A C is a passing grade. That means the order of magnitude of the benefit is the same as the order of magnitude of the cost of the mitigation. A good investment would be a B or an A, and that means that the benefit of the mitigation is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher than the investment that you put in. A bad investment gets a D or an F, and that means that the cost of the mitigation is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher than the benefit you could expect to receive from it. So let's look at an example. This is an actual example. This question came up several years ago. Should we provide UPSs for refrigerators that are storing pharmaceuticals? So the first thing is the load or the consequence. And so would the loss be in the range of $50, $500, $5,000, $50,000, $500,000, or $5 million? So in this example, there's actually 6 lines in this example. The top 3 lines look at 3 different loads, and then the bottom 3 lines repeat that. They look at 3 different loads. But in the top 3 lines, we're looking at $50,000 losses, $500,000 losses, and $5 million losses, right? That's the load that we're going to look at, and we're repeating that twice in this case. Then the next thing that we would look at is the frequency of the event. So the event here is a power failure at the facility, and it has to be a power failure that lasts long enough for the refrigerator to go out of tolerance. So is that event happening every 20 hours, 200 hours, 2,000 hours, 20,000 hours, or 200,000, 2 million hours? Which is to say, is this a daily event, a weekly event, once per quarter? Is it biannual? Is it in that range of 5 to 50 years, or is it a 50-year, 100-year event, right? Well, obviously, it's not a biannual event, and it's not a 50-year event, and so we picked the range in the middle there, which is about a 5 to 50-year or a 20-year event, right? Then we look at the likelihood. So what is the likelihood that the outcome will happen given the event? We actually have some experience with this. Sometimes when we lose power at those refrigerators, our pharmacists are able to move the drugs and avoid the consequence. So it's really the risk, it really happens if the power outage happens at unmanned hours, or if it happens so at night or on the weekends. And even if it happens on the weekends or overnight, those refrigerators have alarms that send messages to security so someone can come and unload the drugs in the case of an event, and we've had that happen. So we put this in the middle. If there's a power outage at one of the refrigerators, it is somewhat likely that we could lose those drugs. It's not extremely likely. It's not even likely. It's somewhat likely. You could make an argument that this could go further down. We could have called it unlikely or rare, but we called it somewhat likely. Now we have to look at the confidence of the mitigation. If we put a UPS in here, then how confident are we that that's going to save those drugs? And in this case, it's not. We can't consider it perfectly confident because UPS doesn't buy us an infinite amount of time to save the drugs. It buys us about 45 minutes. So the power outage happens, the UPS continues to provide power, you got 45 minutes to get those drugs out of there. That's good. That's something we can have some confidence in, but it is definitely short of perfect confidence. So we call this confident, right? Then finally, we have the cost of the mitigation. If the UPS system that we're going to look at here, is it more like a $5,000 investment? That's the top 3 lines that you're looking at there. Or is it more, is it more like a $50,000 investment? That's the top 3 lines that you're looking at there. Or is it more like a $500,000 investment? That's the bottom 3 lines there. The $500,000 investment might be something more like a generator system. And you can kind of see the outcomes, right? The cost of the mitigation, if it's held down, if the cost of the mitigation is held down to that sort of $10,000 or $50,000 level, then we get a C and a B when we get to those levels of pharmaceuticals above $500,000 and up to $5 million. On the other hand, if the cost of the investment is higher, if we have the $500,000 investment, then there's almost no way that we can get a passing grade on this score. So this is how we made the decision. We wrote a standard that said if the refrigerator is storing more than $500,000 in pharmaceuticals, then it's justified to add a UPS to that refrigerator, provided that the cost stays down in that $10,000 to $50,000 neighborhood, right? So that's an electrical example. What about HVAC? Well, as it happens, when we rewrote our standards a number of years ago, about 7 years ago, we actually did this analysis for each and every risk mitigation measure in the Kaiser standards. So I'm going to show you that right now. I'm going to show you it in a series of 5 slides. I'll show you the ones that got A's, the ones that got B's, the ones that got C's, the ones that got D's and F's. So let's start by talking about the A's. The high-ranking risk mitigations are the inexpensive ones or the high-consequence ones. So physical separation between exhaust and discharge intakes is nearly zero cost when we do that during planning, and so that provides a benefit that's well over its cost. Mobile protective environments or mobile isolation environments like ventilated HEPA board or just room deployed HEPA filters, those can be deployed very inexpensively. The event probabilities are low, but the benefits can be quite large and the cost is low, so those are valid mitigations. You see several risks associated with compounding pharmacies. That's because the cost of the medication that we're dealing with in those pharmacies is so large that they immediately move that numerator into the $10 million losses or $100 million losses. So the risk mitigations that we do in that environment can be quite effective. Rounding out the list here are some very simple measures: direct drive equipment, thermal expansion, commissioning, normally open failures, providing 2 chillers rather than just 1, things like that. Now let's look at the B's. This is where we start to see the splitting of fans or pumps. Reduced capacity at failure is a pretty good investment where there are risks. For airborne isolation rooms, pumping systems, cooling systems, it makes sense to have 2 fans or pumps rather than just 1. We're not talking about N+1. This is not redundancy. There's no extra components talked about on this slide. This is reduced capacity during a failure event. We do see some clinical interventions here. About 5th on the list, you see operating rooms. That is to say the mitigation of surgical site infections in operating rooms. The consequence of surgical site infections is, of course, high, so this measure gets a B. Also, 3rd from the bottom is ventilation in waiting rooms to mitigate disease transmission. That gets a B. That's at 2 air changes per hour. That would be for our medical office buildings. Hospital codes, by the way, already call for 10 air changes per hour, which is way above this. That is not necessarily getting a B. And then just under operating rooms, about 6th on this list, I want to point out that monitoring-based commissioning, fault detection and diagnostics is a good investment. That's on this list getting a B, which should make sense, right? Maintenance is a no-brainer, so we can make a relatively marginal investments in maintenance and maintenance smarts, and that goes a long way. Back to the example, if you're single and you have a car that takes you to work, you wouldn't buy 2 cars. You would maintain the one that you have, and if there's a marginal investment that you could make to make that maintenance a little bit smarter, then that's going to make a lot of sense. So here's the mitigations that got a C. These are the ones where the order of magnitude of the investment and the order of magnitude of the benefit are right in the same ballpark. So you can't call these sound investments or good investments, but you also can't say that they're clearly poor investments. So I'll have you notice about 4th down on the list that designing boiler systems with parallel boilers, if the cost of the install is less than about $100,000, is at this level. Again, that is not N+1. That is reduced capacity during 1 failure. And when we say $100,000, that's the boiler, the pad, the piping, and all the controls. So dual boilers is a marginal investment so long as the boilers are kept inexpensive. You'll notice airborne isolation rooms is on this list. Why isn't that an A or a B, you might ask? It's a very confident mitigation, but it's also a very expensive one. And then, of course, you see fan failure in design in an operating room. That's based on a small investment, a small marginal investment at a fan wall or a multiple fan where it's not a significant cost. And then emergency power for cooling systems is on this list, but only if it's very, very cheap. right? Um, these are the next two slides here are showing us risk mitigations where the cost benefit is poor, right? So these are the D's where the benefit that we could potentially get out of the investment is an order of magnitude less than the investment that we have to put in. And I'll have you notice that there are some code requirements here, some very common things that we do in hospitals that fall into this category. In California, we're actually required to put filtration at the exhaust of airborne isolation rooms. That is not a good cost benefit. Providing emergency power for cooling systems, not a good investment. You'll also see about fourth on the list, some on-site fuel storage, up for moderate outages, up to 2 days. That's at this D level. Second from the bottom is where we see dual boilers that are more than $100,000. Still, this is not N+1. This is reduced capacity at equipment failure, and we're at a D level investment. And then finally, we get to the Fs. These are the list of investments where the level of investment required is 2 orders of magnitude higher than the potential benefit that you could get from it. Again, you'll notice there's some code requirements in this category, as well as some things that are very common applied on hospital projects, right? On-site natural gas for 48 hours, emergency power for cooling systems, resilient fans with N+1, fan walls, very common in our designs, not a great investment. Ducted return systems, very expensive, very common in our designs. It's a code requirement, not a great investment. And the fact that we have dedicated fan systems for isolation rooms, that's also a code requirement. Dedicated fan systems for negative pressure exam rooms, by the way, is not a code requirement, so we wouldn't do that unless it's a code requirement. So what's the moral of that section here? What's the moral of the story? First, obviously, within our design program, we must follow the law. Let me just say that. But if you've ever thought about, hey, we should really exceed code. Code is just a minimum. We ought to go beyond minimum. Then I would ask you to think twice about that. Yes, we want to follow the code because it's the code. But the fact that something's in the code does not make it something wise. And so going beyond code does not necessarily make something better. Secondly, I wish I could tell you that every resilience measure that we have in the Kaiser standards has gone through and passed this risk mitigation analysis, and we know that everything that we're doing is a sound investment. That's just not true. So I'll even tell you that the fact that something is in a Kaiser standard does not necessarily make it wise or make it cost beneficial. So let's talk a little more about codes and standards in the regulatory environment, since we're kind of on the topic. And we'll start with emergency generators. So supposedly at Kaiser, we size our emergency generators based on the code. Code only requires that critical and life safety branch, but it requires generator sizing based on connected loads. So the chart that you're seeing here shows the generator sizes at all of our facilities. The y-axis is in watts per square foot. And you'll notice that the total installed generator capacity varies wildly from 3.5 watts a square foot up to 13 watts a square foot. We call this the Christmas tree chart, by the way. The green line or area there shows the generator capacity at each facility, and then the red bars show the capacity at the facility if one generator failed to start. In the unlikely event that one generator failed to start, it's simultaneous to that power outage. The black line at the bottom there shows our estimated loads. We use 2 ways to try to determine that. First, if we have metering on the ATSs, then we use that number. Otherwise, it's based on 60% of the average hourly load from the historical electrical data to that facility. The variance on that number is quite a bit less. The average is about 3.5 watts a square foot. So, and that is an estimate of the load that we would have during an emergency, right? So as we're following code here, we are oversizing our generators. And I've been told for years that this is the code's fault. It is a known problem. Pretty much all of our electrical engineers know when you size generators according to the code, you are oversizing your generators. The problem is so bad, by the way, that it can be difficult to test those generators on a monthly basis. In order to test a generator, you have to put at least 30% load on it. And so some hospitals have to buy load banks so that they can perform that testing because they can't get 30% load onto the generator with what's connected. So to double down on this, in the state of California, we have requirements called NPC 5. Those need to be in place by 2030. We need to have 96 hours of fuel, 72 hours of water and sewer storage on site for emergencies. These requirements were put into the code in the late 80s and the early 1990s based on some earthquake activity in California. And the way that code is written, we have to store fuel sufficient to run their generators at their nameplate capacity for 96 hours. And then we have to provide on-site water storage based on this number, 50 gallons per bed per day for 72 hours. So what does that mean? That actually means that our fuel tanks are going to get way oversized. So just to look at an example here, this is our Ontario hospital in Southern California. Currently we have a 12,000 gallon fuel tank, which based on the nameplate of the generators can only get us 84 hours of runtime. So we need to upsize this tank to provide 96 hours of runtime at the nameplate of the generator. But we're never going to be able to put that much load on the generator. The load that we actually would put on the generator, the black line down there, is about a third of the nameplate capacity, which means that with that 12,000 gallon tank, if we were to run those generators, we would actually get about 240 hours out of them, which is 10 days. So the on-site fuel tanks, by the way, obviously have a whole bunch of maintenance issues. The ongoing environmental and safety compliance is a huge challenge, which it should be, right? You're burying a 12,000 gallon tank of highly combustible material onto your hospital site. So it's no joke, right? So again, just because something is in the code does not mean that this is a wise decision. Now, to contrast the oversizing that we're doing on our fuel tanks, we can talk about the water tanks. The code requires us to size our water tanks for 72 hours based on 50 gallons per bed per day. I've tried to find where that number came from, 50 gallons per bed per day, and nobody knows. Just nobody knows. What we do know is we know that our unrationed water use varies between 147 and 1,600 gallons per day. The average at our sites is 530 gallons per bed per day, but you would never use the average because the variance is so wild. We've also done some studying, we've done some sub-metering studies to try to figure out what would be the actual consumption of the potable only, and that came out to between 52 gallons per bed per day and 300 gallons per bed per day, the average there being about 140. Suffice to say that in kind of 99 out of 100 cases, 50 gallons per bed per day, the way the code is sizing, is not going to get you anywhere near 72 hours. If you were to actually lose water in an event, which is an extremely unlikely event, you would lose it for a few hours. You would only last a few hours based on the tank sizing that we have. In particular, if you don't shut down your cooling towers, then you're at a lost cause almost immediately. For anyone who doesn't know, the cooling tower water use is usually a lot more than the potable water use. So again, just because we have something in the code, it doesn't make this wise, right? This really is kind of a false sense of security that's provided within this measure. One final example just for that's in the making here to potentially make matters a whole lot worse. The National Standard ASHRAE 170 currently has a proposal in public review right now to significantly increase HVAC redundancy. They're calling this reserve capacity. Among other things, this would require on-site fuel for heating and cooling and humidification. So right now we're only oversizing those fuel tanks for electrical. ASHRAE would like us to start sizing those fuel tanks also for heating. And for anyone who doesn't know that fun fact, natural gas usage at hospitals is usually more than the electrical. So this could double our fuel size requirement almost outright. So I've said it already a few times, just because something is in a code doesn't make it wise. I show this example, you may be wondering, how do these things wind up in the code? And this is how. This is an ASHRAE committee. It's comprised of 20 industry experts. They're all HVAC people. So they drafted the language with the best of intentions. They took a vote and they decided to propose these requirements into the code. There were no studies. There were no cost-benefit analysis, right? It was a group of experts that took a vote on it. So ostensibly, this is the main event here. The next 6 slides will show what the KP standard requirements are for resiliency and redundancy within our standards. And we'll start with plumbing. Our standards mostly call for partial capacity at one equipment failure. We do have a 3-pump system called out for on our booster pumps at hospitals. And by the way, if it's not shown here in the slides, then our standard is a single duty. and that falls here. So for like ejector pumps, water heaters, etc., single duty is fine. There's no redundancy required. Moving into HVAC, on HVAC, these are some of the places where we do have a requirement for full capacity within our standard airborne isolation rooms. We would have full capacity at one equipment failure. Compounding pharmacy exhaust, full capacity at one equipment failure. Within the operating rooms, the fans serving the operating rooms, we've asked for N+1. That is based on the lower investment of the fan wall system. And if it's new construction, we also ask for that on the hospital fans within the air handlers. Here's some of the areas where our standards require partial capacity at one equipment failure. I can't emphasize that enough. Partial capacity at one equipment failure. There's not N+1. It's partial capacity at one equipment failure. And that goes for chillers and boilers and heating hot water and steam and pumping. We do have a requirement that chilled water capacity should be able to isolate over to the operating rooms. And we have another line in our standard for multiple circuit air handling coils. Larger technology rooms are N+1. Smaller technology rooms are not. And then we get to pharmaceuticals. We do not require redundancy or even partial capacity at equipment failure in the pharmaceutical areas, but we do require 24/7 planning. So even in a medical office building, if you have an area with shelved pharmaceuticals, then you need to be able to maintain that space between 60 and 80 degrees 24/7. And then finally, at the bottom of the slide, we have a requirement in our standards for multiple pads for HVAC units on hospital project. I mentioned this before because of the cost of air handler replacements. So for new construction, we have that standard in place. Top two requirements on this slide are actually code requirements, or the top requirement on this slide is a code requirement, natural gas storage for 48 hours. That's for the generators. Kaiser standard is to connect the HVAC fans and the pumps and the chillers to the equipment branch of the generator. That is not to say that we can run those things from our emergency generator or that we've sized the generators with full capacity for that. That is just to say that we are going to connect them to the equipment branch so that we have the option to do load shedding and move things over into HVAC if necessary. But certainly, last but certainly not least, is monitoring base commissioning and fault diagnostics. The single best thing that we can do for resilience is good maintenance. So we do have a requirement in our standard that anytime we're doing more than $250,000 worth of controls, we would add monitoring base commissioning, fault detection, and diagnostics to the building. Kaiser does have an enterprise agreement with the monitoring base commissioning provider that is Clockworks. For electrical, we ask our design teams to look at 2 medium voltage services, but that is not really a requirement. That's something for economic consideration. I'll show you an example of that in a second. We do require at least 2 generators on the hospital, and we have it sized so that if one were to fail, we would still meet critical and life safety. For outpatient facilities, refrigerators with more than $500,000 in pharmaceuticals, we call for battery inverters. You guys actually saw the example behind how we got that together. And then we also require UPS protection for MRI machines with run times, not long run times, it's just 5 minutes to save the magnet. I'll show you just a couple of project examples here. The first one being that dual utility feed. We do require our design teams to look at 2 medium voltage utility feeds for hospitals, but it's very much a function of site and availability. So we currently have our San Jose replacement hospital in design, and at that site, the second utility feed is several miles away, so it would cost millions of dollars to have that added to the project, so we're not going to proceed with that. We've had similar situations to that in other hospitals. Our Downey Hospital, as an example, considered this during design, and again, the second feed would have been a tremendous expense, so that hospital has 1 feed, and they have had a utility failure of that feed. I think it was a car accident, if memory serves. Our hospital center of excellence for the last 3 hospitals has been using this dual tunnel design. I mentioned a couple times before that that for hospital air handlers, we actually want 2 pads next to each other. So this was their way of addressing that problem. They put 2 air handlers next to each other, and each of them is a tunnel, and they're cross-connected there. So this is not N+1. This is not 100% redundant design on the air handler capacity, but this is a design where we could essentially lose an air handler, take an air handler out, and we would have partial capacity because the other air handler would continue to serve the space. So the added cost here is really the cost of the cross connection. We have a similar strategy that we've done in our medical office buildings, on the new templated medical office buildings. In those we have rooftop package units, and they have a cross connection between them as well. Originally, I think we thought that we could automate that cross connection. Much of the time we could basically run off of just one unit, but I think at this point that cross connection is just for emergency use. So we have to talk about this for HVAC folks. We have to actually talk about sizing for the load and that partial capacity, because partial capacity at one equipment failure can often mean very good capacity at equipment failure. So to look at this example here, we have a historical peak load that's just under 2,000 tons. That's the actual peak load. But we have a lot of loads. We have a whole lot of time in this system where it can be run at 1,000 tons. And the 90% load is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 tons. And so we can actually, if we were to lose half of the capacity there, we would probably be able to meet the load in this system a solid, 75% of the year. The 90% load is not too much higher than half of the load, which is to say that a system that covers 90% of the year is only a fraction of the capacity of the system of the peak load. So with the best of intentions here, we may want to add like a third chiller. Oh wow, let's do an N+1 beyond the peak, and that's a level of safety where we're designing for something that is a very rare event in the year. So what have we learned here today? Not much, I think. I'll repeat what I said at the beginning. A lot of what we do around redundancy and resiliency is unwise and ill-planned. We make a lot of emotional decisions. We don't have a common industry framework for analysis. We usually don't do cost-benefit studies or risk assessment studies. Our designers have never, they're not fluent in emergency planning. Our emergency planners don't talk to our designers. Our codes have requirements in them that are also pretty clearly ill-planned. And so maybe the message that I want to deliver most is the one, let's remember that redundancy is inherently a bad word. Redundancy means unnecessary. We're literally putting unnecessary components into our system. It's always well-intentioned. Of course it's always well-intentioned. It's always something where the design team feels like they're doing something right, but it's often not that great of an idea. Imagine if every house had 2 front doors. Imagine if every door had 2 door handles. Imagine if every car had like 2 brake pedals. They might sound like good ideas during design, but then when you have to live with them, maybe not so much. So what can we do maybe to end this on some kind of hopeful note? If I've delivered this correctly, then you feel dumber than you did an hour ago, right? Hopefully you feel less wise and less confident in adding extra components. That's good. Hold on to that. I think we should question the decisions that we make around resiliency and redundancy. I think we need to have a common industry framework for analysis. I think we should do cost-benefit studies and risk analysis studies much more often than we do when we start spending money here. More than anything else, though, I think the way that we look at resilience, it kind of comes from the wrong starting point, right? We start by coming up with ideas about what we can add. Hey, can we add this? Hey, can we add that? And that's fundamentally, in my opinion, kind of a misguided approach. If we want to design for higher reliability, we need to start by becoming students of failure. We need to learn more about failure modes. We need to learn what fails and why it fails and how things fail, and then have that lead us towards what some of those effective mitigations really could be. So that's something that I'm interested in doing moving forward in the future. Thanks.